Are you going to Scarborough Fair? Parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme. Remember me to the one who lives there. She once was a true love of mine. Tell her to make me a cambric shirt. Parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme. Without no seams, no needlework, then she'll be a true love of mine. Tell her to find me an acre of land. Parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme. Between the salt water and the sea strand, then she'll be a true love of mine. Tell her to reap it with a sickle of leather. Parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme. And gather it all in a bunch of heather. Then she'll be a true love of mine. Are you going to Scarborough Fair? Parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme. Remember me to the one who lives there. She once was a true love of mine.
Good morning. Our opening words this morning are by Monica Jacobson Tennyson. What is it that calls you here, that calls you onward, that calls you inward, that leads you homeward? What is it that gives you the power to make that change, to ask that question, to take that journey? What is it that says you have done well, that asks you to learn more, that brings you to stillness, that holds you up in hard times? Is it relationship? The beating of heart of our faith. It begins when we share this hour, our truths, this air, our hearts. Come, let us worship together. And as we always do, now I just want to welcome you with live from Fellowship Hall. It's our LCUUF Sunday service. Now, there were some announcements that were on a slideshow before the service. If you didn't see them, that's not a worry. We'll be sending an email out tomorrow with those details.
Our chalice lighting words today are by Judith L. Quarles. At this hour, in small towns and big cities, in single rooms and ornate sanctuaries, many of our sibling Unitarian Universalist congregations are also lighting a flaming chalice. As we light our chalice today, let us remember that we are part of a great community of faith. May this dancing flame inspire us to fill our lives with the Unitarian Universalist ideals of love, justice, and truth. Please light your chalice and then join us in singing.
We kindle this light and
Each week, we take time to remind ourselves that we belong to a community which cares for each other. We do this by sharing any significant joys or sorrows in our lives. If you have a joy or sorrow to share today, you can type it into the chat now, and we'll read those aloud. Okay.
Oh, okay. We have a concern this morning from Kathy Coaches. Please light a candle of concern for our good friend, Linda Buckthorpe, who is very ill with COVID-19. She is being cared for at home by nurses 24/7 as there are no hospital beds available in Guadalajara.
oh,
Mm.
We have a sorrow from Dee Dee, who says Dee Dee's good friend let her daughter yesterday from COVID, lost her daughter yesterday from COVID. She was only 25 years old.
Now let us recall the joys, whatever you may be celebrating, whatever evokes a feeling of joy or peace for yourself or others. You're welcome to type joys in the chat box.
We have a joy from Sharon Robinson. She says, I am filled with such joy because I feel seen and heard by you all. I don't have to carry my secret anymore. All such gifts to me. I feel such gratitude, joy, and love for all who have contributed their skills to last Sunday's service, received the message, supported me, and gave me such loving, positive comments. Thank you for especially practicing principles 1 and 3 and for being who you are. We have a joy from Liz Mulder, who says, Linda, that is one of my favorite songs, beautifully presented by you and Michael. Can't get enough good stuff these days. We have another joy from Liz, who says that a young friend in Youngston has recovered from COVID. She is just 17 and her whole family was ill with COVID. This is Colleen Beery, and I have a joy, which is my family issue is resolving. That's all I see.
And this candle from our care team represents those sorrows that are too raw, too difficult for us to share aloud. So many of us have had losses, partners, children, grandchildren, losses that remain present with us every day. So many of us have burdens, anger, fear, and frustration, all of those things that weigh heavy on our hearts. We will light this candle for all those unspoken sorrows. A number of years ago, when I was working in stewardship development for the Unitarian Universalist Association, I would conduct workshops on congregational growth as one of the many components of financial stability. It was while researching growth at the denominational level that I ran across the fact that American Amish population was greater than the number of card-carrying Unitarian Universalists. At first, I found this somewhat amusing, but then I began to wonder, how is this possible? They sit in the dark and read the Bible by candlelight. They use horse and buggies for transportation. Many don't even speak English. And yet, in this last decade, their numbers have continued to grow, while UU membership still hovers around 200,000. What is their secret? Is there something to learn here? What may surprise you is that we have some things in common. Really. On the religious side, they're decentralized. They meet in small cluster sects where they discuss, debate, and decide the rules by how they will live their religious lives within somewhat severe biblical constraints. They practice capitalism and they're entrepreneurial. On the liberal side, the Amish refuse to fight in wars. They gather to build houses for one another, donating their labor. They support one another in business, and they believe in the value of providing for the greater good of their community at large. It turns out their growth rate may be the direct result of their sense of community and support they provide each other. Their children do not leave the community, but are baptized, marry, and start very large families of their own. So yes, they are larger, but the horse and buggy Amish are strongly devoted to being separate from society. They have even expanded to dozens of states to seek further isolation. UUs have clearly chosen the opposite path and have taken on societal injustices of race, gender equality, education, and war. For decades now, we have challenged the status quo, protesting, lobbying, legislating for change, and we have succeeded on a scale that should be unimaginable given our numerical size. So let's step on the gas, pass the buggy, and explore how so few have accomplished so much.
Unitarian Universalists have long valued education. Historically, our whole approach to understanding the Bible and later other sacred sources is not to take these texts as materials to be accepted blindly, but as materials open to critical thought and inquiry. We have applied this approach to other areas of life, and it shows up in how we cherish liberal, that is, critical education of everyone, but especially of children. I want to mention a couple of examples where Unitarians influenced how we educate children even today. Unitarian Horace Mann is remembering for promoting and establishing the kind of free public education system that most of us experienced in our youth. About Mann, one historian wrote, "No one did more than he to establish in the minds of the American people the conception that education should be universal, non-sectarian, and free." Certainly these ideas spread through America, but also to other places in the world too. Now, Mann grew up in a Calvinist church, but in 1810, when he was 14, his brother drowned. At the funeral, the Calvinist minister preached of damnation in hell for those who were not converted. And Mann realized that he could not abide such a cruel religion, and later sought out a Unitarian church. Mann became a politician, a state senator, and ultimately the secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education. There, he controversially argued that state education should not teach any specific religious doctrine to children, as was the practice at the time, but rather teach just the general moral concepts common across all Christianity. Now remember, this was the early 19th century. More importantly, he promoted state funding for education so that schools would be free of charge and rigorous training for teachers was provided. These ideas spread beyond Massachusetts, throughout America, and also to other places in the world. Sophia Lyons Foz was a religious educator who revolutionized Unitarian children's education in the 1940s and 50s. Foz promoted what was called religious education. Yes, that was the technical term for what some would have called Sunday school. This term was used over, this style of education was used over previous styles of teaching such as catechism, where children were expected to simply memorize church teachings and learn Bible verses. Foz's approach was much more progressive. Foz felt that children were naturally curious, and if a good curriculum allowed children to experience and experiment, they would come to religious faith through their own discovery. Further, she felt that modern religion had to take science and rationalism seriously. She said, to build the beginnings of faith in God on a conception of the universe that our generation no longer regards as true is to prepare the way for a loss of respect for the Bible and what is worse, to court a cynical atheism when the child is old enough to learn for himself. I understand Foz's promotion of the experiential education went on to influence children's education outside of the religious realm. However, I've not been able to find that reference again. Certainly, Foz influenced other mainstream denominations as well, which adapted her ideas on religious education. Unitarian Universalism has long valued the importance of education. It's no surprise that many of our largest and oldest churches are located near universities. But more deeply than just valuing education, we value the way education is done, valuing ideas such as freedom of thought, critical thinking, experiential learning. In examples like these and others, we have promoted these values into the world.
I grew up at UU in the 60s, and my earliest memories were of our minister, Reverend Lear Clance, preaching about racial injustices and the power of peaceful protests and the need to make our Unitarian Universalist voices heard. Born a Southerner, he saw firsthand the injustices of Jim Crow South, voter suppression, and the deadly work of the Klan. He frequently organized and led local UUs to protest marches in Washington, D.C., Atlanta, and Alabama. Our congregation was small, but had a long history of activism long before Reverend Clance. Yep, that's the church I grew up in. The church itself was historic, having once been a stop on the Underground Railroad. As kids, we were allowed to ring the giant church bell, calling folks to service. The belfry was where the slaves were hidden on their way to Canada. And there we were, ringing the same bell for what was frequently a sermon on civil rights. The congregation of my youth was small, but they added their voices with other Unitarian Universalist congregations across North America in the struggle for racial equality. The civil rights movement called the Unitarian Universalists. A little known fact is that both Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King both attended Unitarian Universalist congregations while living in Boston. They both believed that our principles resonated with their beliefs. However, in Coretta Scott King's words, Martin and I realized we could never build a mass movement of Black people if we were Unitarian. In 1965, Reverend Martin Luther King appealed to clergy across the nation to come to Selma, Alabama, and join protesters in their struggle for voting rights. In all, more than 200 Unitarian Universalists responded, including about 1/5 of all Unitarian Universalist ministers. And that involvement took an early and deadly toll. 3 of the early victims to violence were the Reverend James Reeb, Viola Leozzo, Unitarians and white civil rights activists killed in Selma, Alabama in March 1965 by the KKK, along with Baptist deacon Jimmy Lee Jackson, an African American who was shot to death by an Alabama state trooper in 1965. After these events, the Unitarian Universalist Association moved its annual board meeting to Selma, where, in coordination with Dr. King, they identified how we best lend our voices to the movement. As a result, Unitarian Universalist ministers and congregants actively participated by preaching sermons, marching alongside civil rights leaders, and participating as freedom riders. UU involvement with civil rights did not start with Dr. King's call to action, however. In the 1950s and 60s, there was a scattering of Unitarian Universalist congregations making their presence known and voices heard. And as many of you might imagine, the white power structure did not welcome their presence whatsoever. The Reverend Gordon D. Gibson in June of 2000 presented a working paper to the General Assembly on the role of Unitarian Universalist congregations in the South during civil rights era. He wrote, "The South, ruled by white power structure and pervaded by an ideology widely shared by its white residents, was facing a crisis in ideas and social patterns at just the time the Unitarian Universalists began to be a visible and contrarian presence after World War II. The white South felt besieged and was in a mood to strike back at those perceived as agents of change, as outside agitators, or as traitors. Persons operating on the principles that were inherent to now Unitarian Universalism were almost inevitably a challenge to the Southern mores and social patterns. Southern Unitarian Universalist congregations faced a choice: retreat from the South, as Unitarians had previously avoided the South, or learn to live in tension, offering sanctuaries of openness in an otherwise closed society. Most chose the latter, though it was a difficult stance to maintain. It led some congregations and many individuals to what could be characterized as small acts of great courage. The ministers who served these congregations in this era were heroes. They stood tall when it would have been easier to keep their heads down. They lived and mostly thrived in places that most of their colleagues avoided, some at grave danger. So, would the civil rights movement have succeeded without Unitarian Universalist participation? Of course, but because of the sacrifice of the brave and determined few like James Reed and Viola Leozzo, and the brave ministers and members of the Southern congregations, we maintained our presence and continued to use our pulpits to serve the greater effort of liberating African Americans. Here is how Reverend Gibson summarized our impact during this time of chaos and change in the South. With these stories of congregations, stories of individuals, stories of acts small and large, of great courage, what these stories do mean is that Unitarian Universalists often provided an early crack in the closed society of the white South. In response to an ideology allied with religious fundamentalism, we were religiously open and tolerant. In response to an ideology that depicted some people as great worth and others of little worth, we proclaimed the worth and dignity of all persons. Today, UU congregations, not only in the South, but across the country, continue to challenge oppression against race, manifested through voter suppression and the criminal justice and police brutality. The Unitarian Universalist Association has embraced support for Black Lives Matter movement, and our congregations will no doubt again prove our ability to provide cracks to the societal norms by making our voices heard through both words and deeds.
Unitarian Universalism has never been fully pacifist in theology. We are different from the Quakers and the Mennonites and even the Amish in this way. At times, our churches and associations have supported wars, and in World War I, the American Unitarian Association even went so far as to punish churches and ministers that did not support the war effort. Nevertheless, we have long been committed to a peaceful world. As theologian Paul Razor put it, Unitarian Universalists have always affirmed peace as among our most basic values. We have always worked to create the kinds of just communities out of which peace emerges, and we have long supported the use of nonviolent methods of conflict resolution. This is the legacy we share with pacifism. So even though we are not a pacifist tradition, a theology of nonviolence runs deep through Unitarian Universalism. A significant early thinker was the Universalist minister Aidan Ballou, who in 1846 published a book titled Christian Non-Resistance, in which he suggested that Christians resist evil with what he called nonviolent love. However, such ideas of peace became unfashionable with the Civil War, and Ballou was pretty much forgotten in the United States. Ballou's book made its way to Russia, however, to Leo Tolstoy. Tolstoy, after achieving fame and wealth with his novels, had a spiritual crisis. He began reading widely, including Ballou's book, and corresponded with Ballou before Ballou died. He later would say that Aidan Ballou was the greatest American writer. In 1893, Tolstoy would go on to write a book about his own faith, in which a central point was what he called the law of non-resistance to evil by violence. While Tolstoy's book was banned in Russia, copies made its way to other countries where they were reproduced. Tolstoy's book made its way to Mahatma Gandhi, who was just 24 and living in Pretoria, South Africa. Initially, Gandhi was skeptical, seeing this book as just another attempt to convert him to Christianity. But on reading it, he said, "The book overwhelmed me." He also said, "Its reading cured me of my skepticism and made me a firm believer in ahimsa, or nonviolence." Gandhi wrote several books on his philosophy of nonviolent resistance. Some of Gandhi's books made their way to Martin Luther King Jr. around 1950. King began to base his ideas for social change on Gandhi's work. Now, King had already been studying the book Civil Disobedience by Henry David Thoreau, that early Unitarian writer. However, Gandhi's ideas of nonviolence really clicked for King. King wrote, "It was in this Gandhian emphasis on love and nonviolence that I discovered the method for social reform that I had been seeking for so many months." Now, I should be clear that other black theologians and leaders were studying Gandhi as well, including the teachers of Martin Luther King. But King was uniquely able to adapt Gandhi's thinking into a practical model for social change in the United States. And this is where that thread, that early Unitarian Universalist ideas of nonviolent social change reconnects with the story that Kriss told of UU involvement in the civil rights movement.
In 1969, Unitarian Universalist minister James Stoll became the first ordained minister of a major religious group to come out as gay. He spent the next year writing articles about gay rights and delivered guest sermons at several churches. He all but put the important first stake in the ground for Unitarian Universalists. In 1970, the General Assembly in Seattle, in 1970 at the General Assembly in Seattle, the Unitarian Universalist Association passed a resolution condemning discrimination against homosexuals and bisexuals. Since 1970, there have been several UUA resolutions supporting people, regardless of sexual orientation. The UUA has officially supported its clergy performing services of union between same-sex couples since 1984, and has supported the same-sex marriage since 1996. In 1998, the first openly transgender person was ordained by the UUA, and in 2002, Sean Dennison became the first openly transgender person to be called to serve a Unitarian Universalist congregation in Salt Lake City, no less. And the first two ministers to be prosecuted in the United States for performing same-sex marriages were Unitarian Universalist ministers Kay Greenleaf and Don Sangre. They appeared in court in 2004, charged with multiple counts of solemnizing a marriage without a license. All charges against these two ministers were eventually dropped. Though the UUA has embraced same-sex marriage since 1970, many within the congregation did not. In 1987, the Unitarian Universalist Association introduced the Welcoming Congregation program to help UUs learn how to undo homophobia and later transphobia in their congregations and wider communities. The program outlined a series of educational initiatives and workshops that congregations could engage in and deepen their understanding and acceptance of the LGBTQ members. I remember participating in one specific aspect of the program. Our church hosted what was called 4x4 dinners, where heterosexual and same-sex couples gathered for dinner and discussed the challenges faced by same-sex couples in the congregation and in the greater community. I remember hearing for the first time the pain couples feel over being marginalized. Simple things like not being able to hold hands or show affection in public. It was something I had never thought about and opened the door to revisiting things I thought I knew and deepening my understanding of the daily challenges that as a heterosexual, I never had to face. As an aside, when I was working with UUA, the headquarters is right next to the State House in Boston on Beacon Hill. And they had a 3-story banner that said, "People of Faith for Marriage Equality." Well, sometime after that, I actually managed to walk across the alley and take a tour of the State House. And that's where I discovered that the governor's office was literally across the alley from that 3-story banner. And the governor was Mitt Romney. So I like to think that he looked out the window every morning and was reminded of the importance of faith and marriage. Currently, Side with Love has been one of the most successful interfaith public advocacy initiatives sponsored by the Unitarian Universalist Association, promoting respect for the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Side with Love confronts issues of exclusion, oppression, and violence, be it based on sexual orientation, immigration status, gender identity, race, or religion, through advocacy, public witness, and speaking out in solidarity with those whose lives are publicly demeaned. No other denomination has done more to advocate, legislate, and fight for LGBTQ rights than Unitarian Universalists. Beginning in the 1970s and continuing to today with the Side with Love advocacy initiative, UU clergy and congregations have had a disproportionately large and lasting impact on the lives of the LGBT community. Just consider the thousands of same-sex civil unions and marriages our clergy has performed over the past 5 decades. We provided a safe space for couples to share and celebrate their love when they were being turned away everywhere else. This has not come without a cost. Our churches have been targeted by hate groups, clergy threatened, property damage, and in the tragic case of the Tennessee Valley Unitarian Universalist Church of Knoxville, congregants were murdered in their own sanctuary. Yet, despite the danger, the threats and challenges, our congregations continue to work and advocate for love and acceptance of all people. As a denomination, our numbers have not changed in 40 years. Our advocacy and outreach, however, continues to grow.
I consider myself a bit of a connoisseur of religions. I'm happy to try anything, give it a taste, even if it's not going to become a staple dish for me. I enjoy attending services of other faiths and have fond memories of services in mosques, synagogues, and temples of various kinds. And when Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses come to the door, I'm happy to talk if I have time. But my home base is the progressive traditions. If there wasn't a UU fellowship and I was seeking a religious community, I'd explore groups like Center for Spiritual Living or Unity Church, or I might find a progressive Buddhist Sangha or a Sufi group, Dances of Universal Peace, or maybe a Quaker meeting or a progressive Christian tradition. I've sampled all of these. But there is one thing that sets us as Unitarian Universalists apart from most of these other traditions, and that is our attention to social justice work. We do personal work, spiritual work to become better people, certainly, just as most of these other faiths do. But more than most faiths, we put a lot of effort into making the world a better place. In fact, many of us think that we become better people ourselves by working to make the world a better place. So while we're small in numbers compared to other traditions, I do think that we punch above our weight when it comes to social justice work. We strive to create a world where justice will roll down like waters and peace like an ever-flowing stream. It's in our history. It's in our communal DNA to work to change the world, to live our lives in such a way that when we're gone, the world has been made a better place. Hymn is number 121, We'll Build a Land. The words are by Barbara Zanotti, a feminist activist, and the tune is by UU activist and singer-songwriter Carolyn McDade. Please join in as you like.
We'll build a land where we bind up the broken. We'll build a land where the captives go free, where the oil of gladness dissolves all mourning. Oh, we'll build a promised land that can be. Come build a land where sisters and brothers, anointed by God, may then create peace where justice shall roll down like waters and peace like an ever-flowing stream. We'll build a land when we bring the good tidings to all the afflicted and all those who mourn, and we'll give them garlands instead of ashes. Oh, we'll build a land where peace is born. Come build a land where sisters and brothers, anointed by God, may then create peace where justice shall roll down like waters and peace like an ever-flowing stream. We'll build a land building up ancient cities, raising up devastations of old, restoring ruins of generations. Oh, we'll build a land of people so bold. Come build a land where sisters and brothers, anointed by God, may then create peace where justice shall roll down like waters and peace like an ever-flowing stream. Come build a land where the mantles of praises resound from spirits, one faint and one sweet, where like oaks of righteousness the people stand, her people go. We'll build a land where my people will see, build up the sisters and brothers we seek. Come build a land where justice shall roll, peace like an ever-flowing stream.
This is the time in our service when we ask that you remember that we share our gifts here through pledging and donations. We are not meeting in person now, but our connections to each other and our contributions to the community continue. Instructions for payments to the fellowship are on a slide during the announcements before the service every week. And while you're considering your gifts to the fellowship, remember that each month, LCUUF donates 5,000 pesos or more to an organization providing food aid in our lakeside community. For the month of January, we are supporting the Tepoa Community Center, providing funds for meals. When you pay your pledge, please add something for Share the Basket, as you used to place pesos in our physical basket. You can donate in the same way that you pay your pledge, but please donate Share the Basket separately or indicate what part of your donation is for Share the Basket. Your offerings are greatly received.
Let us extinguish our chalice with these words, which we read together. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we keep in our hearts and share with all the world.
Amen.
And our closing words are by Kathy Huff. Our time in this service may have ended, but our connection to each other and this community remains. Together, may we walk the path of justice, speak words of love, live the selfless deed, trod gently upon the earth, and fill the world with compassion. Until we meet again, blessed be. Now, after our postlude, we'll have a 5-minute break, and then we will reconvene for our LCUUF annual general meeting. Everyone is welcome to stay, though only members will be able to vote. We hope you'll get some coffee or tea or whatever and stay with us.
We will not stop singing. We will not stop singing. We will not stop singing till the world can hear the song, till the world can sing along. We will not stop marching. We will not stop marching. We will not stop marching till the world can hear the song, till the world can sing along. Till the world can sing, till the world can sing, till the world can sing along. Till the world can sing, till the world can sing, till the